All right. Good morning, everyone. Happy Sabbath. And this is a great morning outside in sunny Washington. We have no liquid sunshine. We have just sunshine, I believe. So I want to thank you for joining us, and thank you, James, for joining us in our meeting as well this morning for Zoom Sabbath to go over chapter 57 of Patriarchs, Prophets, and Kings. It's chapter 57, and it's following after Nehemiah chapter 13. So I want to thank you again, James. Before we begin, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for this morning. Thank you for our Sabbath school lesson this morning, Lord, for those who can join us, for those who join us later on, may they be able to understand and appreciate this chapter about reforming, about reformers, the need for reform, the need for repairing the breach, Lord, to go back to your truth. Lord, be with us, send your Holy Spirit to us, and guide us in our discussion, and may it be a blessing to us and to others. Chase away Satan and his angels that might want to interfere, and give us clarity of thought and of mind. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, well, as we usually do, let's kind of give you a brief summary of this chapter. This chapter is an introduction of how Nehemiah, though he's been called to help reform and to rebuild Jerusalem, he had asked special permission from the king of Persia, and he came the first time, and it was actually 12 years, history shows us. And then he was either called back or he returned back to Persia for a stint. We don't know exactly how long, but he comes back, and it seemed after several years, and we'll kind of reference that at the discussion today, to find that there was a setback, right, James? There's a setback of not only the people, but of leadership. There was an intermarriages, there was an unholy alliances. We're going to talk about that, and how perhaps the most important, God's truths were not upheld. In fact, the key one, which was the Sabbath, was desecrated, and we'll show how the temple was desecrated. And we need to know how that was important then and how that was important today. So let's begin with, I'd like to kind of go and discuss our first question. Let me post that for us today and see if it'll post you. All right, very good. All right, here's the first question. Why was the alliance from Eliashib, the high priest, and Tobiah, the Ammonite, through their children's marriage, why was it an unholy alliance? What was the back history, and what was the outcome, and how did Nehemiah kind of remedy this? And maybe we can even add in and discuss how can these sort of things happen today to kind of give it more of a practical application. James, I'll always kind of ask you and I to take the lead, and we'll have a discussion and go to the next question after that. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, if we look back in Numbers, I believe 21, it was very clear, even from the time of Moses, that God expressly, very specifically said, don't unite or interact with the Ammonites and the Moabites. They were the descendants of Lot, if you remember. But throughout history, we see that they were absolutely the sworn enemies of the Israelites. At every step of the way, I don't remember reading a single account of them being cooperative or helpful for the cause of God's people. But at every time they were thwarting them, trying to stop their forward progress. And if you remember in the previous chapters where Nehemiah was spearheading the building of the walls of Jerusalem, that Tobiah the Ammonite and Sanballat and somebody else, they were trying to stop that progress. And I remember even one time, I think they even called Nehemiah out to try to draw him into just a secret meeting between him and them, with, I think, motives to try to kill him. And so these are not gentle, these are not holy or lamb-like people. They're, I believe, instruments of Satan to try to destroy and thwart Israel's progress. And being the descendants of Lot, they very well know, they're half Jewish practically. They know what this is about. They know what's at stake. They know these are God's people. And so I think that, the question says, well, talking about the alliance and marriage, Tobiah and the Ammonites are basically cousins to the Israelites. But it brings up a good point that, sometimes even in our church, unfortunately, there can sometimes be people who may become very malignant to our church. I think nobody's perfect, and I've certainly made lots of mistakes and outbursts in church that I'm not proud of. But this is this example of Tobiah. It's a repeated act of animosity against Israel's people. And I think God sees our hearts, and we know that by the fruits of a person, we know where their heart lies. And it's very clear that Tobiah, the Ammonite, hasn't changed a bit. He's still out to pursue his own interests against the interests of God and God's people.
Right.
And then I think that placed Nehemiah in a very awkward and very difficult situation. I mean, in one verse he says, what does he say? He says something like, it grieved me bitterly. It grieved me bitterly. And that's quite an understatement. I can imagine the pathos of emotion that Nehemiah is going through, because, they're familiar with Tobiah, and he's had this, conflict with Tobiah for many, many years. And I imagine if I were Nehemiah, I would be struggling personally with feelings of bitterness, resentment, anger against Tobiah, coupled with asking God to give me a heart of forgiveness, to give me a heart of understanding and mercy. But yet, that there's a fine line between being accepting of people under God's grace and mercy, versus sometimes you have to put your foot down and say, this person is unfortunately malignant to the flock, and we need them to leave. Yeah.
No, I agree. We see that in this particular story too, that that this Eliashib, he is the high priest, and high priest, they stand to be, the whole reason why Nehemiah brought them back was to focus on the rebuild, the wall, the temple, and all these things. And the leadership that came with it was the priesthood, right? The Levites. And the focus was the temple. The focus was the repairing of the walls. And you can imagine that leadership like the high priest was essential, right? And they would help, kind of motivate and also help the people. And here's Eliashib, the high priest, none other than the highest of the leadership in the priesthood, joining forces with Tobiah and the enemy, the sworn enemy of not just the Jewish people, but of course Nehemiah, and how he was trying to get in, and if he couldn't get in, he was attacking. And to the point of now, their children got married, and now there's a alliance. And so when you get alliance, and that's what they used to do in Europe, right? They tried to marriage by marriage, ally the families together, which we know that was never going to be successful, but that's what they try to do. And they, politics, and then we will find out later on how Solomon used to do that too. But here's Eliashib, the high priest, and Tobiah, the enemy, the Ammonite, getting married through their children. And there were some side benefits, right? And as you mentioned in Numbers, there's a backstory of the Ammonite. It goes way back. It's not even just Tobiah and the Samaritans and the people here. It was actually Ammonites, the people who attacked Moses and the Israelites as they were leaving Egypt, going through to the promised land. They needed access and they wouldn't, and then throughout the time they got attacked. And this is a story of Balaam, right? Balaam was the one that actually kind of got them to say, hey, look, if you want to destroy these people, well, first of all, he was asked to curse them, right? But then God changed it around and used his words to bless them. But later on, it was Balaam who figured out a way to topple Israel through the intermarriages of the pagans. So, there's a back history. And God says, you shall never join forces either for blessings or for any advantages. And he says, the curse was for 10 generations. That's almost like that's like 1,000 years. So God said forever. So God was not like, well, after a period of time, if they ask for forgiveness, you can join. God says, boom, do not intermingle. And here is Elisha, the high priest, mingling. And then at the end of this, we see that there's a side benefit that Tobiah got. Because remember, this whole time he tried to come into Jerusalem, and Nehemiah said, nope, you cannot do it. And here he is now, Tobiah getting an in. Nehemiah leaves, right? He gets the children to marry. Now all of a sudden he gets a special privilege. What's that special privilege? He gets to have a side apartment next to the temple. And it was like, what? Here's an enemy, a sworn enemy of not just Nehemiah, but of God, told to never have a relationship with these people, to give them any kind of blessings. And here's Tobiah getting a blessing from the high priest, and he gets a side room that he gets to use as a kind of a penthouse. But guess what this side room was? Remember when the reading, it says it was the storehouse of the temple. It was God's special room, the storehouse, which people would give money to donate, and it would be kept there. So what did Elisha do? He cast it out. He threw it out, and he allowed Tobiah to keep residence there, he and his household. I was like, wow, what was Elisha thinking, right? And how dishonorable to God.
That would be like Pastor Sam has a office, like a lot of people don't know, in the second floor of our church, and it'll be like, sorry, Pastor Sam, my sister-in-law just got a husband, and he's not Christian or anything, and he's actually a Satan worshiper, but I'd like him to take over your room and just throw out all of Pastor Sam's belongings in there and just put. It just seems very inappropriate, sacrilegious, whatever you want to say.
Absolutely. And so the question really is, and of course Nehemiah, what does he do? He comes in and he says, "What did you do, Elisha?" And he comes back and he sees this, and he throws all of Tobiah's stuff out, says, "Get out of here." And they have to actually do a ceremonial cleansing, because Tobiah was considered a Gentile, and an unclean Gentile who actually desecrated the temple. That's how bad that situation was. And so the question really pertains to, yes, that was bad, right? And this is what he did, and he remedied it. Otherwise, there would have been a very bad curse, I think, along the people. Two things happened when Tobiah, came in, and they threw out God's stuff and gave precedence to this Gentile, an idolater. All of a sudden, the people, it showed how the people kind of got into the same habit, like, if our leadership acts that way, maybe we don't have to worry about the storehouse. Maybe the tithes that and the offerings, all of a sudden, we don't need to donate it to the church. And so all of a sudden, the church started falling apart. So that people didn't give tithing, and then the people who worked for the church started leaving. So it had consequences. And so what does that mean to us? So I think that if we unfortunately desecrate the holy, right, with the worldly stuff, and sometimes that's what happens. Sometimes we use our church to kind of combine with the unholy, and then eventually, if for whatever selfish gains or whatever, I think there are consequences, I would think. Yes. We'll even get into more of this later on. So what are some of the consequences that happen with these unholy alliances? So let's go to the next question right here. All right. So kind of on the same line, James, about having these unholy alliances. What did it do? There was several people who got together and did things, and the people started saying, oh, well, I guess if Eliashib and our leadership are mingling with these other pagan nations, I guess we can do that too. And so they started doing this, and they started mingling. They started working with them. And one of the things they did was actually start working with them in business, right? Mm-hmm. The question is, how was the Sabbath compromised by these unholy alliances with the idolaters? How did Nehemiah remedy this too? And how does these happen these days? Do we somehow, in our relationships, somehow are we compromising the Sabbath? What do you think about this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Nehemiah 13, that this chapter is based upon, it states that with these alliances, they started bringing in the grain and wine and all sorts of goods into the temple area, and started selling them on the Sabbath. Basically just continuing to carry out everyday affairs for their own gain and interest. It says that, when Nehemiah confronts them, he says that, why are you profaning the Sabbath? Profane the Sabbath. That word profane is very interesting. It's in many ways the antonym or opposite of holy. And in some definitions, what profane really means is common. That is, why are you make the Sabbath just another common, ordinary day, when you very well know it's a holy day set apart for God, where it's a sign of your allegiance to God, but it's also a time for you to honor and praise and thank Him. It's a very special day. It's like a date night, a very special day between you and your significant other. And so I think that what Nehemiah does, of course, is he denounces it, and he closes the gates of the city so that these merchants wouldn't come in. And there's certainly references here, reminders of when Jesus chased out the sellers on the Sabbath from the temple. But an interesting quote in this chapter, which I'd like to just point out real quick, is on page 670 of Prophets and Keys, chapter 57, where it says, they had lost their zeal and fervor. They had lost their zeal and fervor and were reluctant to pay their tithes. You can very well substitute reluctant to pay their tithes as to put in reluctant to keep the Sabbath as it should, because they had lost their zeal and fervor. So I think, these are great questions where, you alluded to how they were starting to allow idolatry and idolatrous influences to come in, intermarriage with non-believers. Not sin in and of itself, but the Bible and God's counsel was avoid them, because you're playing with fire and you're going to introduce very powerful influences in your life that you're not going to be able to control. And here we see the evidence of that. But part of that process is just a subtle, slow decline in one's conscience and desire to be and know and follow God, and a loss of your zeal and fervor. Certainly characteristics that the Bible warns us that in the last days we will too have contentions with. But I think without that zeal and fervor for God, everything else will just get thrown out. We're not gonna. Why would we want to spend time with a loving Father who we have no passion or interest for, right? But it's subtle. I think, we in the medical field, we don't know if someone's body is declining, but we look for signs and we look for tests, like a pulse oximeter, that little device you put on your finger to measure one's oxygen levels. I don't know. I don't know if someone's oxygen levels is going low, but that tells me. And often what happens is as someone's lungs are diseased or having problems or infection, the oxygen levels just slowly decline. It's subtle, where the person may not even know it until it's so low. And maybe it's even too late. I mean, never too late, but it's so low that now they're starting to really feel it. And I think this is kind of a similar situation. Slowly, just little compromises. They allow these unholy influences in their life, saying, it's not bad. It's not a bad thing. It's okay. It's okay. But I think they add up, and they start us on this slow, slippery slope to create a hypoxic or deoxygenating effect, where before you know it, you're totally neglecting a desire to want to pursue God, to spend time with Him, and you're breaking the Sabbath, you're, doing whatever, you're no different. You're profane, you're ordinary. You're not a special, set apart people of God.
You always wonder, these people who are the idolaters, right? Mm-hmm. I don't want to give them any kind of like excuse, but I'm sure, like you said, they know some of their back history. The Jews definitely should have known their back history, but people forget. They're more interested in their current day. What can they get for themselves? How can they make an extra buck? What kind of relationship, side benefits we get. But and these neighbors, idolaters, who worship their idols, they kind of look at the Jews and say, another business opportunity. I want to make another buck with them, maybe have a relationship and sell them more fish, sell them more bread or whatnot. But they don't necessarily understand that maybe the Jews, they in order to do this sometimes on a certain day, like the Sabbath, they have to kind of forego their beliefs, right? They're like, the Jewish leaders are not really enforcing it, and we're not giving tithes anymore, and they're really not keeping the Sabbath, and the temple is closed down. The workers and the singers, and they've taken hiatus, so maybe we don't have to keep the Sabbath, and maybe we can start doing business. And all of a sudden, little bit by little bit, they start to do that. Back in the day when Moses was told by God, says, do not associate with the Gentiles. Don't associate with them and have idol worship. Because once you start having idol worship, what is the key fact for worship? What made the Sabbath a unique thing for the Jewish people? It set them apart. Ellen G. White says, even in this chapter, and Moses did too, that keeping the Sabbath set them apart to kind of recognize that, if you worship the Sabbath, what are we focusing on? It's the creator of the Sabbath. And if you don't go and do idolatry and worship other idols, then the Sabbath would never be profaned, because, worshiping other gods or worshiping other gods, right? If you worship on Sabbath, you worship God because you're worshiping Creator. And if you protect the Sabbath, you're protecting from idol worship. If you don't have idol worship, you're protecting the Sabbath. And this is where Satan was slowly chipping away. And this is the reason why God couldn't protect them when they were pursuing after other gods. And so the Sabbath key was an issue. Just a little compromise here, a little bit more, and then you get them, chipped away by these people who wanted to do business. And so even Jesus said this, I would just tell you this part. In Matthew chapter 24, verses 15, even Jesus said this. So when you see this standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This is something that, I have studied and referenced before, because why would Jesus say something like this? Standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation. Now, we know from reading the Bible and history that Jesus was referring to the Roman, this was a warning to the Christians, right? When to flee out of Jerusalem, because Titus would come with his Roman standards from Rome and to siege Jerusalem, right? And then they were chased back. And then remember, Cestius came, and then Titus came back later on. And that's when, 70 AD, there was a siege over Jerusalem and millions of people died. And the only people who escaped Jerusalem was who? The Christians. I think some people, Bible stories Bible students, they kind of know that story, but they're like, what does it have to do with this commentary that we're talking about? If you look at this, it says here, when you see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation. The abomination is actually the Roman standards. It's a representation of paganism, right? And when they put the standard on the holy place, a lot of people think that holy place was actually the temple, but it actually wasn't the temple. What this was actually was Nehemiah, and this is kind of going back to the question, how he remedied this. He says, you know what? You guys need to keep the Sabbath holy. Quit relating to these people. Quit having business on the Sabbath. And so he closed the Sabbath gates, the gates on the Sabbath day. He says early, not like a minute before. He says in well preparation. And that's kind of a reminder for us. When we have Sabbath preparation, we shouldn't try to scramble in a minute's time left, right? We should be preparing for the Sabbath, right? And then when Sabbath comes, the doors are closed. No business to be done. And in fact, he chased away the people, and the neighbors tried to come into the neighbors, to the gates, try to get a few more business transactions. And he says, no, get out. And in fact, what Nehemiah did, he's actually made like 100 feet around the border of Jerusalem, the wall. And he says, this is holy ground. This is to preserve and protect the Sabbath. And this, I did some digging, and that's what that really what was referencing, this holy ground. So when the standards came and they put it right there on the holy ground, it was desecrating the holy ground. And the holy ground was meant specifically to protect the Sabbath. It was interesting, huh? And so Nehemiah created holy ground to say, this is holy ground. Do not come near this on the Sabbath day. Protecting what? The Sabbath. Jesus referenced this many years later, and he says, when the standards come, the abomination comes to stick on their holy ground, that's your sign, people, to flee. And the Jewish people, the Christians, realized that, and not one Christian had to die. Further later on, Ellen G. White says, in its reference to this and why it's important to this discussion today, Ellen G. White says this prophecy was actually doublefold. Jesus gave it to the disciples to tell them, because the Jesus gave this answer to the disciples, and the disciples asked Jesus, when is the time of the end? Jesus could not, Ellen G. White said, tell them about the future, our second coming. But this was a double prophecy that when Jerusalem was going to be attacked by Rome to flee, but also a warning to us people today that when the pagan standards get placed on the holy ground, that's a time for you to flee to the mountains. And Ellen G. White said, this day, when the Sabbath is being attacked, and being attacked by what? And this is actually reference to the Sunday law, actually. It's another discussion altogether. We can go on time today, but I wanted to just lay it out today that this prophecy, current today application, is when we know that our Sabbath is being attacked from within and also from without, when we don't cherish the Sabbath day, and when we allow it to one day be, I guess what would you call it, kept in an unholy way. And when the Sunday law happens, it is actually when Ellen G. White asks, actually, and Jesus too, is asking us to prepare to flee. Anyhow, that's a really interesting conversation. I don't know if what you have to say about that, but I wanted to go to the next question after that. Any thoughts on that comment?
No, I think you explained it very clearly.
Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next question here. What is the question now is, how this is a reference to Solomon, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. What do you think? How did the unlawful marriage alliance cause confusion of Israel? And we kind of mentioned that a little bit today, so we can kind of briefly go through this. Why did Nehemiah remind the people and the leadership of Solomon? How did this reminder help turn the tide so that the people wouldn't be punished? And especially, how important are the responsibilities of those in charge of God's service? Are just because they're in leadership, do we get a special exemption because we're in leadership? What do you think about that?
Yeah, Nehemiah 13, Nehemiah, brings in the example of Solomon. And he says in verse 13, chapter 13, verse 26, 27, that he says, didn't Solomon, wasn't he beloved of God, and God made him king over all Israel? He was the wisest man that ever lived, reported. And then it says, nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. Even Solomon, King Solomon, the wisest man, through his polygamous association, intermarriage with what it says, pagan women, it led him to sin. And so, again, it doesn't say that the intermarriage is sin, but it says it led him to sin. It's, to me, it's similar to, say, for example, like alcohol. It's not sin to just drink a little sip of alcohol. I mean, maybe, you never know. Maybe you drink some grape juice and a part of it accidentally fermented, and maybe you inadvertently drink a little drop or two of alcohol. But it can lead to sin. You're playing with fire, And so, who in their right mind would want to do that if they're aware of that? But I don't know. Perhaps Solomon himself was blinded by the beauty of these women, or maybe he just wanted to fulfill something empty in his heart, and instead of filling that with God, he said, "Oh, let me go ahead and marry all these women that are pleasing to my eye." And so I think, let's see, this question, it says, how important are they? And so, the responsibilities of rulers and leaders. I like the quote. It says in this chapter, where in page 6, also 670, it says, a lot of these sins and waywardness could have been prevented had the rulers and leaders, but had it been for their desire to advance their own interests. And that had led them to favor the ungodly. But it also gives us hope and leads us in saying, it says, there were some who could not be persuaded to sacrifice principles. I think when you look at the history of God's people, especially in the Great Controversy, there are always some who stand unyielding and they don't compromise their principles. But I really like that. I think had they not advanced their own interests, Solomon, perhaps you can argue, he advanced his own interest by intermarrying with pagan women, then a lot of this would have been prevented. A lot of responsibility does lie on the shoulders of our leaders. They're examples. People look up to them. Their influence is widespread and also in subtle ways. And so I think at the heart of this really is, do they seek to advance God's interests, or do they seek to just simply advance their own interests? Mm-hmm. That is, are they looking to advance God's interests over their own? I always like twisting the famous JFK quote, ask not how you can advance your own interest, ask how you can advance God's interest.
I agree wholeheartedly. You would think, oh my goodness, if Solomon was the wisest man in this world and he fell, what hope do we have? And sometimes, when we look at the life of Daniel and we look at the life of Moses, what made them special and what made them succeed? It was their humility. When we see David, and when we see Saul, and we see Solomon, when did they succeed? It was in their humility, maybe at the very beginning stages of the life. Then all of a sudden, they became more proud, self-sufficient, maybe pursuing their own interest, their own way. And then we see David falling at the end, when he was in his height of his career. We see Saul kind of going downwards on his, height of his career. And then we see Solomon, when he finally, at the very beginning, he was very humble and says, God, what is the one? I don't want wealth. I want my, he was given a prayer request, right? And he says, I just want to be wise so that I can lead my people well. I need your help. If you're sufficient, if you are self-sufficient, you have issues. If you are dependent on God for decisions and helping, your life, then you are doing well. And this is where I think Solomon made the mistake. He wanted to kind of, through his unholy alliances, trying to manage and create these alliances and control peace his own way. And he knew he knew what Moses told him not to do. He knew he wasn't supposed to marry into the princess of Egypt, right? What was he thinking? And so, of course, the question is, do our spouses have special ends to our hearts? And the answer is yes. And unfortunately, we start to compromise. The one king who, in his greatest story as the beginning monarch, he preserved the life of a baby. Remember the two prostitutes that were fighting the mothers? This is my child. No, that's my child. And he goes, get a sword. Let's cut it in half, as a test, of course. And the mothers said, no, this is, don't do that. Give it to her. And then obviously we figured out the wisdom of Solomon. The life of the life of the baby was preserved by the true mother, because he didn't want it to be hurt. We have that same king who preserved a baby's life later on in life because of the influence of his wives and the pagan idolatry, sacrificing children. What sadness, right? How far he has fallen. And he says, you guys are doing the same thing. Nehemiah says, if you do this, this is what's going to happen to our lives, and God cannot protect us. Unfortunately, these people heeded Nehemiah's words, and they decided to change ways. And he says, even you, the priest's son, you who married the Servite, I forget the name.
Semblance.
Says he actually was cast out, not just only cast out of service, but cast out of Jerusalem. And this actually brings us to the next question of what happened to these people who were eventually cast out, who didn't want to give up, their marriages, and who didn't want to comply. They left, especially those who in service of God, they left. And this is ultimately what happened. Question number 4, how did the mixture of Judaism and heathenism from the Jews who left to join, hold on one second.
But yeah, how what happened to cause problems for years to come? What do you think will happen these days when we mix our truths and compromise our beliefs? So yeah, as I remember reading in Nehemiah 13 that Nehemiah, he strongly promoted the truth and started a reformation. Yes, there was a little bit of fear, fire, and brimstone in the beginning, but sometimes it takes that to stir us up, to wake up our senses and say, wait a minute, I have neglected some things in my life that I shouldn't be neglecting. And it did cause some people to come back. And I imagine maybe some of them even left their wives. I imagine some of them had to sacrifice their well-being and their livelihood to come back and reform and turn to God. But there were also some who didn't want any of it, and they weren't willing to give that up. And so then they left. They left the place of Jerusalem, and I think a lot of them went north to Samaria. And there were other, idolaters and heathens. They sort of intermingled, mixed, and they even built their own temple. And later, many, many years, this becomes the background for the horrible, embittered animosity between southern Israel and northern Samaria, where it paints the background for stories like the Good Samaritan. The Israelites listening to that story must have been just like aghast at how could a Samaritan be the main figure of this story to help that poor person who was beat up on the road. It also sets the background for when Jesus meets the Samaritan at the well. Mm-hmm. The Israelites hearing that story, like, what? Why would you even interact with a Samaritan, Jesus? Let alone she's a woman. I've absolutely, that's just, you don't understand that here in today's equal society. But back then, women were definitely of a lower status. And so, but she was Samaritan. And so we could see that, yes, for many years to come, this created a horrible, divisive rift, a source of pain. And the last thing is, we think that Nehemiah was this strong, cold, overbearing authority. But Mrs. White in this chapter very touchingly says that he had much anguish of soul. He was in a constant struggle with the opposing elements. It was not easy. He struggled. It was not easy for him to bear down like this and try to reform, knowing that there would be people who would leave and would never come back. In fact, it says one of the most difficult things for both Ezra and Nehemiah was that even amongst pretended friends, supposed friends in the church, that secretly they were in opposition to this reform work. And that was the most painful, difficult thing for them. And so I think this question is great in that, yeah, it makes people who are trying to pursue God and trying to promote his interests, it pains them. It makes it very difficult.
I love the way that you kind of brought it back to some of the stories of Jesus and the Samaritan and the lady at the well. What we worry about is diluting the truth, infiltrating our truth with untruths. And that's what Satan does. He does that, right? And kind of combines it to lead people away. And eventually you have a religion that people think, oh, isn't this the truth? When it was filled with truths and untruths. And that's what we have to worry about. And the Samaritans thought that they have the truth, right? Oh, isn't this our well, Jacob's well, and we have the truth. We're waiting for our Messiah. And Jesus says, well, if you knew who was asking for this water and offering you, the living water, you would give it gladly. And so you see Jesus's attitude towards the Samaritan as if he wants to give him a second chance. He didn't. Remember, he says, you are worshiping the wrong mountain. There's going to come a time that everybody will worship on the same mountain. Jesus doesn't mince words. He says, you have forgotten the truth, but there will come a time where you will be given the opportunity to receive the Messiah and have the same living water that everybody else gets. And that's a lesson that he wanted to teach the Jewish nations, that they got so caught up in this fighting, and so fighting for what purpose? This was it. This was a Jewish nation who came out of Jerusalem, who left because they didn't want to give up, their own things. They mixed with the heathens. They created their own little kind of religion, right? They wanted to compete. They were kind of angst with, being kicked out. So they kind of said, well, fine, we'll do our own thing. And they mixed, heathenism with Judaism. And that's the creation of the whole Samaritan cause, right? But Jesus says, if you follow me, then you'll be forgiven. And nowadays, how does this kind of ring true to some things that we kind of hear about what happened after the Christianity, right? Early Christianity, they started being transformed. The disciples took it to the world, but then what happened? Constantinople, they started mixing paganism, right, with Christianity, and the same thing happened. And unfortunately, we have the form of, and it's a common knowledge, right? The people in the Catholic Church may be wonderful, but the history of Catholicism, how did it begin? It was mixing of paganism and Christianity, and that's what had happened. And Jesus loves the people, didn't necessarily love the mixture of untruths, right? And he calls people out. And that is kind of our duty, saying, we have to present the truth. And if we love the people, we have to present the truth as it was supposed to be, and then love people and then call them out. Same thing as Jesus actually did here as well. And I do think that we have a special purpose, and we have to see, do we know our truth? So, and how do we go about helping other people? Let's go to question number 5. And thank you for that, James. I hadn't even thought about those until you mentioned that, and I think that was so appropriate. When we are called to help in the reform, how can we be like Ezra and Nehemiah in not excusing sin? We want to stand true, we want to be like a compass. We want to be direct. We want to call sin as it is. We don't want to mince words. We don't want to compromise. We don't want to make excuses for ourselves. But there is a way to reform. And I think Ezra and Nehemiah kind of showed us how to do that. And I think Ellen G. White is very clear in saying, you know what? There are reformers and there are reformers. If you try to reform people with a hammer and beating people on the head and saying, I'm right, you're wrong, you know what? You will chase people away. You will give the Reformation a wrong spirit, right? What kind of spirit do we need? And I think looking at this chapter, it was very, very, very important to know how we did this. So, and unfortunately, as we do this, and the second part of the question is what Ellen G. White referenced, sometimes the hardest obstacles is not the people who oppose us from the outside. Sometimes it's the people that we know, unfortunately. So what do you think about this question, James?
Well, I'll start with a quote in page 674 on this chapter. It says that there was a constant struggle for Nehemiah and Ezra as they helped bring about the reform with opposing elements. And only by fasting, humiliation, and prayer, was advancement made. So in other words, it wasn't, it could not be done by their own power. I think if you look at any kind of Reformation event or process, many of them die out because if it only rests within us, human nature, it's easy to give up, very easy to give up. And there's always going to be opposers, people who doubt, hey, is this the right thing to do? Hey, is this going to get you anywhere? What is this going to accomplish? I mean, there are going to be people who question it, and rightly so. It's healthy to doubt and question. The Bereans, they always double checked the Bible, right? But only by prayer, humiliation, fasting. That means that Ezra and Nehemiah needed to rely fully, rely heavily, rely solely on God to continue to convict and tell them that, hey, I want you to do this, and I'm right by you, and I'm going to give you the power and the means to do it. I think that was the only way, because otherwise, I remember when I was part of the founding committee of GYC, we had a lot of opposition. In fact, we had very great difficulty finding a sponsor to hold fundraising money. I was a treasurer, so I kind of knew that aspect of that process. Many churches, I'm not going to name any churches, but some of the major local churches cast doubt and said, hey, what is this? What's new about this? What is this going to accomplish? Why don't we just stick with what's already here? And so I think similarly, Ezra and Nehemiah would have faced a lot of opposition. People would have had similar arguments. And just the fact that even some of their pretended friends and supporters may have very strongly, maybe even harshly opposed them would have been very discouraging, gut-wrenchingly discouraging. And so I think that would just have led them to more fully get on their knees and pray to God and ask Him for the courage and strength to move on.
I agree. With Ezra and Nehemiah, they saw the waywardness of the people, and they weren't afraid to call sin out. And when they tried to make reformation, and they met resistance, and those were with people from outside, like Tobias and all these other people. But there were also the people within, right? Those who didn't want to work hard, those who kind of were actually impeding the work of building the wall, right? They were kind of working in alliance with Tobias and all these other people to try to give them bad reports and try to figure out how to, sabotage, Nehemiah, and like I said before, try even to assassinate Nehemiah. And then there's these, in today's chapter, it talks about even how the inside people try to even fund the resistance of this Reformation. And we get that, people who are, not in alliance, with the Reformation that needs to be done. There'll be haters, there'll be obstructions, and unfortunately, those are the ones that are sometimes the hardest to even work with. But here, unlike many of the people who had the right to just bulldoze everybody else and call them out and just line them up and just say, hey, you guys all kicked out, we're going to kick everybody out who doesn't follow what, and just have a spirit of dictatorship. No, I think in the story of Nehemiah in the previous chapters, and I'm sure previous Sabbaths, they had a humility. Remember, Nehemiah had every right to claim to be this ambassador and have lived well, right? But he lived like everybody else. He didn't accept any more money. He, in his humility, this chapter says, he prayed. He prayed for the people. He actually prayed as if he himself had sinned and petitioned before God. He said, God, forgive me, forgive these people, be with us and help us to uphold your truth. And he did. He upheld the truth, but in a spirit of humility. And I posted the question number 6 because I think I was referencing this earlier, and this was the last question. What does it mean to have true Reformation? What does it look like? What are the qualities of the people pursuing this Reformation? What is the spirit of this Reformation? And are we called to a similar Reformation in our time? And how do we proceed? How can we protect the laws of God that have been breached in our days? And I think that leadership, as well as people who, I'm talking about leadership in our church, but also to leadership in the conference, right? Because the work has to be done before Jesus comes. There is a breach, and Jesus wants to come to bring his people back. And it says here in this chapter, in chapter 676, the work of restoration and reform carried on by the returned exiles under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah presents a picture of a work of spiritual restoration that is to be wrought in the closing days of this earth's history. Interesting, huh? So Ellen G. White's actually saying what they're doing to repair the breach and to reform and to change the life and the waywardness and disregarding the laws of God. Because what they had was the laws of God, right? And the key thing that was being breached was actually the Sabbath. And so it was very important for Nehemiah how you don't worship idols because it profaned the Sabbath, and you take the focus away from God, our creator, right? And everything he did was to try to protect that wall again so that people won't attack, and allowing God to help them to build the wall. And so people around them saw that the wall was being built in a miraculous way. They're like, God is in this work. And he never took credit. And that's the kind of the reference I think we need to do in our work. If we as church leadership, as we as general conference, as we see the world and we see our conference working to try to remedy, what is it that they're focusing on? What projects are they working on, right? I think that we on our knees to be saying, God, forgive us of my sins. Remember the story of Daniel, when he was praying for his people, what did he do? He was without sin, but yet he was praying for the sins of the people. And that's the part of the work of the priesthood, right? They ask, for forgiveness of their own sin, but they also ask for the forgiveness of, the people. And I think that there is a work to be done. And and it says here, the remnant of Israel were a feeble people exposed to the ravage of the enemies, but through them God purposed to preserve in the earth a knowledge of himself and his law. They were the guardians of the true worship and the keepers of the oracle. And I think that is kind of our responsibility too. What is it that we're preserving? What is it that we want to show the world, right? In fact, we kind of have to realize, what is it that we are trying to teach, and what is it that we're trying to preserve, right? And I think we have to kind of go back to sometimes that as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I really appreciate about this chapter, the very last chapter of Nehemiah 13, in many sense, it's a very anticlimactic conclusion to the book of Nehemiah with all these amazing reforms, and it ends with leaving you kind of unsure of what's going to happen. It's talking about all these problems, Sabbath and intermarriage. But throughout this thing, it's personally inspired me to ask, how can I become a better spiritual leader in my own sphere of influence? And as I look to the example of Nehemiah, he is, as in all the chapters, in my humble opinion, of the Bible, the 66 books of the Bible, there always is a glimpse of Jesus hidden away, or sometimes overtly displayed, of who Jesus is, who Jesus was, in every chapter of the Bible. And certainly it is the case in Nehemiah. And in many ways, you can argue that Nehemiah is also a type of Jesus. And what I learned from this is that his characteristics, he didn't care about his title or power. He was a reformer. He was on his knees fasting in humility and prayer. He was inspired with a great purpose. His aim was to set his people right with God. And to that end, he would stop at no expense. He would be willing to do everything and anything possible that he had on his hands and resources to accomplish that aim. And so that zeal and fervor that he displayed with this process of reformation, it says that the result was that the people would be united, hopeful, and eager. United, hopeful, and eager. And I know you're going to mention this, but one of the key phrases and thoughts that I came away with this chapter was that Mrs. White nicely introduces that verse in Isaiah. I think you're probably going to mention that, Isaiah 61 and Isaiah 58.
Perfect timing. Why don't you go ahead and read it down? Let me post it for people.
I don't have the whole verse, but there's some key phrases saying that, hey, we need the repairers of the breach. We need the restorers of the path, the repair of the breach, the restorer of the paths. And that is a direct reference to the coming Messiah. Jesus was the repair of the breach. Jesus was the restorer of the paths. And Nehemiah was a type of Jesus here. He was an example for what was the true restorer and repair to come, in repairing the walls and restoring the Reformation, leading God's people back to him. This was an example. This was pointing to the true repair, Jesus Christ. And so today in 21st century, it's a challenge for me personally and for us to ask God, help me to be that repair and restorer for your people and for your children in the world.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind of those concluding remarks, and I think that's so appropriate, James. And I'm so glad that we had this conversation, because it was a very important chapter. Oftentimes, our church, our parents, maybe individuals have been accused of saying, you know what, you're so legalistic. Why are you always talking about the Sabbath and do this and don't do that? And I don't want us to get into the habit of being like the Jewish nation at the time of Jesus, right? They were so minutia nitpicking that they lost the focus of the Sabbath, right? It was about do's and don'ts. And yes, it was very legalistic. They lost the God of the Sabbath, right? They lost the purpose of keeping the Sabbath. And Jesus came there to show them a different way, a different approach to different, saying, but yet Jesus was very wholeheartedly passionate about protecting the Sabbath. So much so that he says this is going to be the key in the future. The Sabbath will be attacked. The abomination will stake its standard and try to take away the worship of the one true God. Worshiping on Sunday will be like worshiping not God, right? It's like idolatry. Who do you choose this day to worship? Idolatry or God?
Mhm.
This day I will choose to worship God. And the Sabbath is such a holy thing that it is, if you think about it, what do? You worship God. And that particular day, you think of God, and you see and understand the reason why we keep the Sabbath. It's not about minutia. It's not about this. It's not about what you can or cannot do. And I think, unfortunately, we have fallen to that state. And I want to try to teach my own children and anybody that I talk to, other people, about the importance of the Sabbath, right? And as we close up, this is what Ellen G. White says. In words of unmistakable meaning, the prophet points to the specific work of this remnant people who build the wall. If thou turn away from the Sabbath, from doing thy own pleasure on thy only day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honorable, and shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. God has given us a promise. It's his own promise. And if we keep the Sabbath holy, and we keep it a delight, and we understand that the Sabbath is meant for us, but it was meant for us to keep the Sabbath in a very special way, I think then we'll be blessed in a special way, right? That's right. So thank you again, James, for joining me today. I hope that anybody who has a chance to review this chapter in the light of what we discussed today, I hope they can review it again and just glean the blessings from it. So James, can you bless us with a prayer?
Oh, sure. Dear gracious Father, Lord, thank you so much for this discussion on the final chapter of Nehemiah, the reformation and restoration that you wrought through him. And we too, like Nehemiah, can become an instrument for you to advance your own interests, and to be a restorer and repairer of the breaches and paths. And so we thank you so much, and be with us now as we spend the rest of the time with you today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
All right, thank you everybody for joining us. So join us for church service at 11:15. You can join us online or come in person. We'll be looking forward to that as well.